When we're doing coverage on our yearbook, we tend to want to write stories, feature stories, where we're writing paragraphs of text, and that's just because we're most familiar with it. However, it is the least read information in your yearbook. Stories are great when you have a lot of content, when it's a very important topic and you need to cover it in detail. And we will have stories in our book, but we want to also make information digestible and not have just story after story after story, but instead explain information or show information in a way that our readers will actually want to read it and show it from a different light. There are tons of different ways to tell a story, and Yearbook Besties has actually created 50 ways to tell a story, and we're going to go through these and talk about what alternative coverage is. So, what stories do you want or need to tell? These are what are most important, what has a lot of detail, can I get a lot of opinion from it, all of those kinds of things. And what information can you get about that topic? Can you get enough to really write a full-fledged story that would be very interesting for people to want to read? Do you have great candid photos to go with that story? And then you really want to make sure that you can incorporate student voices. And remember that stories are better when you have photos that are associated with it, and not just photos, but great photos. And usually our feature story always goes with our dominant element, and that's your biggest photo on your spread. So it should be a good photo. Your dominant element that's 2 to 3 times larger than anything else should be a great photo to really draw the reader in to want to read the story. So when we're looking at things, don't be afraid to get inspired by other sources. I tell people to really go look at magazines, look online. You can see lots of stuff that you can really grab from. You can see this comic book in the bottom left, example from Behance. You can really find so many options. And even though these are mainly about sports, you could do this without it being about sports. So when you start to design, you really need to start thinking or getting inspired in designing. You need to start thinking through, like, what is the topic of this, but how could I change it? And pull from that information. You could do infographics instead, or a how-to, or a different way of showing a graph that isn't just a pie graph. Like, look in this top left here. This is essentially a pie graph, but looks very different than a pie graph. This is a timeline, but doesn't look like, a line with a little arrow and a line with an arrow. It looks different than what you had. Here you have a poll of like one compared to the other. Lots of different ways to show information. So where can you get this information? There's a website called RB Digital. There's Ads of the World, Graphic Designer Portfolios. Behance.net is actually owned by Adobe now. It has tons of options. Pinterest, magazines. Look around you. Advertisements everywhere are constantly showing you designs and what you can do. A website called issue.com shows magazines online. There's so many things. So 50 different ways to tell a story. This is not about a feature story. Usually the 5 Ws is when we would write a feature story. We're covering who, what, when, where, and why, maybe even the how piece of it. You're pretty familiar with the 5 Ws and the H. From that point forward, you can really start writing stories or telling stories in a different way than just writing paragraphs. So maybe it's an advice column, or maybe it's an autobiography where the person that we're writing about is helping you write it. Maybe it's about before an event, during an event, or after an event. Maybe it's behind the scenes, or behind the curtain, or behind the teacher, or behind the life of a student. All of those kinds of things could be done. You can break something down and show it in different parts. You can do something by the numbers where you're really focusing on the data and using the numbers of the data to drive what you're doing. A calendar version, a chart. And when I say a chart, please don't think that I mean a bar chart or a pie chart. I would challenge you to make those look even more different to really challenge yourself and make it more interesting for the reader. Maybe do a compare and contrast, a do's and don'ts, a fact box, favorites list, like for instance, like best playlist or favorite songs of the year, a fill in the blank where you would do like, my cap and gown means this to me, like my cap and gown means, and then you would fill in the blank with everything else. a glossary. Like, for instance, when I'm filming this, we have been in distance learning, we've been in hybrid, we've been in asynchronous learning, we've been in so many things, self-paced, teacher-paced, just cohort, all this new vocabulary that we have for our virtual learning, and we could do a whole glossary on that. So especially if something is introduced into a school and is a whole new set of terms. A graph, which could be, graph and chart are kind of the same. A he said, she said, or a freshman said versus a senior said. It doesn't have to be he said, she said. A how-to, so breaking down maybe how to do rock climbing if you want to cover the All Things Mountain Club. An infographic, which you can just look up the word infographic and see millions of ideas. An illustration instead of having a candid photo, a list of things, a Mad Libs, a map, a matching situation, a minute by minute. We did one of these last year after I'm filming this, where we explained what it was like to have a fire drill, not a fire drill, but the fire alarm go off in the middle of a snowstorm that no one was prepared for. Like, we had students walking out in flip-flops. And so we gave a minute by minute of Mr. Hamlet's AP class because they had a very interesting story. And so we gave minute by minute for that. Multiple perspectives. You can just do this from, like freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. Maybe you do, a club perspective where you're grabbing somebody from the international club and somebody from, DECA and somebody from Key Club and somebody from ATM, and you're getting perspectives on that. Maybe you do it from a sporting event where you're getting a coach, a cheerleader, a star player, a backup player, the sports med people, the person who's clocking the game, lots of different things. You can do a photo diary. You can have polls, a profile on somebody where you're getting in depth with their story, a pros and a cons, a question and answer where you have questions and people are then answering them, a quiz, quotes, just basic quotes from people. Maybe we're talking about how people would rate something, doing a recipe round table where you're asking for all, it's kind of like a perspective one, but you're doing more of a round table style, a scale, a schedule, social media post style, stats, just full stats one, a STEM completion, a step-by-step, a this or that timeline, top 10, 5, 7, if you use your year, you could do like top 21, transcript of conversation. So just really going through what that would look like when you have that transcript. Who knows best, a word association, an expectation versus reality, and an A to Z. So tons of different ways to tell a story. And we're going to go ahead and get into what do those different stories look like.